December 26, 1996. A child disappeared from her home in Boulder, Colorado. When she was found hours later, investigators collected DNA evidence that should have been the key to solving the case. Instead, that DNA became the center of a 3-decade battle that may have actually prevented justice from being served. Tonight, we examine how scientific evidence meant to solve a crime became the very thing that delayed resolution, how debates over interpretation stalled investigation, how institutional conflicts paralyzed progress, and how a piece of evidence that should have brought clarity instead brought 3 decades of confusion and delay. This is the story of how the criminal justice system struggled with a case not through lack of evidence, but through an inability to agree on what that evidence meant. How DNA that could have pointed toward a suspect became a source of institutional division. How the most advanced forensic science available became entangled in competing interpretations and theories. And how 3 decades later, we're still asking whether justice will ever be possible when the very foundation of the case remains disputed among experts and investigators. Before we dive into this complex story of how science, investigation, and justice collided in ways that created decades of delay, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here at True Crime Vault, we examine not just the crimes themselves, but the systems that investigate them and the challenges those systems face. New investigations every week. If you're interested in how criminal justice actually works, the complexities of forensic evidence, and the institutional dynamics that can affect case outcomes, hit that like button and drop a comment with your thoughts. Have you followed this case over the years? What do you think about the role of DNA evidence in complex investigations? Let me know below. JonBenét Ramsey was a child who loved performing and spending time with her family. She lived in Boulder with her parents, John and Patsy, and her brother Burke. The family was well established in the community. John ran Access Graphics, a computer services company that had become highly successful by the mid-90s. Patsy was active in social circles and charitable activities. They lived in a large Tudor-style home in an affluent neighborhood. The family attended church regularly and were known in the community. By all outward appearances, they represented success and stability. Christmas 1996 was celebrated in ways that millions of American families would recognize. The family spent December 25th with friends at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close family friends. There were other families present. Children played together. Adults socialized over food and conversation. It was a festive, ordinary holiday gathering. JonBenét was her usual energetic self, participating in activities and enjoying the celebration. The family returned home that evening around 8:30 or 9 o'clock. Both children were tired after a long, exciting day. According to statements later provided by John and Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car during the short drive home. John carried her inside and upstairs to her bedroom. The exact sequence of events after arriving home would later become a subject of extensive investigation and questioning. The Ramseys stated that JonBenét was put to bed without fully waking, that Burke went to his room, and that the parents made final preparations for an early morning trip planned for the next day. The family was scheduled to fly to their vacation home in Michigan early on December 26th, then continue to Florida. Patsy stated she went to bed around 9:30 or 10 o'clock. John said he came to bed shortly after. The house grew quiet for the night. But something happened during those dark hours. Something that would transform this family, this house, and this investigation into one of the most analyzed and debated cases in modern criminal justice history. When morning arrived, nothing would ever be the same. At approximately 5:45 in the morning on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey came downstairs preparing for the early trip. She was descending the spiral staircase from the second floor when she noticed papers on one of the steps near the bottom. As she got closer, she realized it was a handwritten note. She began reading and quickly understood what it claimed to be, a ransom note stating that JonBenét had been kidnapped. The note was extraordinarily long for such a communication. It spanned 3 full pages, written on lined paper in handwriting that would later become a major focus of forensic analysis. The writer claimed to represent a small foreign faction and stated they had taken JonBenét. The note demanded $118,000 in cash, an oddly specific amount that investigators would later learn was very close to the amount of a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. The note provided specific instructions for delivering the ransom. It warned against contacting police or other authorities. It contained threats about what would happen if the instructions weren't followed precisely. The writing style of the note struck investigators as unusual from the beginning. It contained references that seemed to come from popular movies. It addressed John both by his first name and more formally. It referenced his business. The tone shifted between formal and casual language. The note was signed with initials, though the meaning of those initials was never definitively determined. Multiple theories emerged over the years about what they might represent, but none were confirmed through investigation. Patsy's immediate response was to scream for John and to run upstairs to check JonBenét's room. The bedroom was empty. The bed appeared to have been slept in, but the child was gone. The terror and panic that must have gripped the parents in those moments is difficult to imagine. The ransom note threatened dire consequences if police were contacted, but their daughter was missing. They faced an impossible decision in those first moments: follow the note's instructions or call for help. At 5:52 a.m., the Boulder Police Department received a 911 call from the Ramsey residence. Patsy Ramsey reported that her daughter was missing and that a ransom note had been found. The 911 operator attempted to keep Patsy on the line to gather more information, but the call was relatively brief. The recording of that call, which has been analyzed countless times over the years, captures obvious distress in Patsy's voice. Police were immediately dispatched to the residence. Officer Rick French arrived first, pulling up to the Ramsey home at approximately 5:55 or 6 o'clock a.m., just minutes after the 911 call. He was responding to what dispatch had characterized as a kidnapping. The circumstances were highly unusual. Kidnappings were extraordinarily rare in Boulder, particularly in this affluent neighborhood. But the ransom note existed, and the child was reportedly missing from her bedroom. So French approached the situation as a kidnapping case. This initial characterization would have significant consequences for how the scene was handled in those crucial first hours. The response to the scene in those early hours would later become one of the most scrutinized and criticized aspects of the entire investigation. It's important to note that this criticism isn't meant to suggest negligence or bad faith by the responding officers. They were making decisions based on the information available to them at the time. But the reality is that the scene was treated as a kidnapping for several hours, which meant it was not immediately secured and preserved as a homicide scene. This distinction matters enormously in terms of evidence preservation. Officer French conducted a preliminary search of the house. He walked through multiple rooms and areas looking for any sign of the missing child or of forced entry. He went to the basement, which had several rooms and storage areas. According to his later testimony and reports, he checked a small storage room that the family sometimes referred to as the wine cellar. The door to this room was latched closed. French opened the door and looked inside with his flashlight. The room appeared dark and empty from his vantage point. He did not enter the room fully or conduct a thorough search of it. He closed the door and continued checking other areas of the house. This moment would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case for years to come. JonBenet was in that room. Had French entered and searched it thoroughly, she would have been found hours earlier than she ultimately was. But French was operating under the assumption, based on the ransom note, that the child had been taken from the house. He was looking for signs of forced entry, for evidence of how kidnappers might have entered and exited, for clues about where they might have taken the child. The idea that the child might be deceased in a basement storage room didn't align with the kidnapping scenario everyone was operating under at that point. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at the Ramsey home around 8 o'clock that morning. She became the primary detective on scene and would remain there for several crucial hours. By the time Arndt arrived, the house had already begun to fill with people. This would become another major point of concern in the investigation. Friends of the Ramsey family had been called and were arriving to provide support during what everyone believed was a kidnapping crisis. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived. John and Barbara Fernie, other close friends, came to the house. The Ramsey's minister was contacted and came to provide spiritual support. A victim advocate was also present. All of these people had the best of intentions. They were there to support a family going through what they believed was a kidnapping crisis. But what none of them realized at the time was that they were actually inside what was a homicide crime scene. Every person present, every surface touched, every movement through the house was potentially affecting physical evidence. The crime scene was being inadvertently compromised simply through the presence of multiple people who had no reason to believe they needed to avoid touching things or moving through areas. This situation highlights one of the fundamental challenges that arose in this case from the very beginning. The ransom note created a false framework that shaped the initial response in ways that would have lasting consequences. If there had been no ransom note, if JonBenét had simply been found deceased in the house, the response would have been completely different. The house would have been immediately secured as a crime scene. Everyone except essential law enforcement personnel would have been removed. Evidence preservation would have been the paramount concern from the first moment. Instead, for approximately 8 hours, the house functioned as a gathering place for friends and family supporting the Ramseys during a presumed kidnapping. People moved through rooms. They made coffee in the kitchen. They sat in various areas of the house waiting for the phone call that the ransom note had indicated would come. The crime scene was being contaminated, not through anyone's fault, but through the simple reality that no one understood the situation for what it actually was. As the morning progressed, the situation became increasingly tense and concerning. The ransom note had specified that the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. to provide instructions for delivering the ransom money. John Ramsey had immediately contacted his bank after police arrived. Arrangements were made to obtain the $118,000 in cash. By mid-morning, the money had been delivered to the house and was ready. Everyone waited for the phone call. It never came. The lack of contact from any purported kidnappers was a serious red flag for experienced investigators. In legitimate kidnapping cases where ransom is demanded, kidnappers make contact to arrange payment. The entire point of a ransom kidnapping is to get money in exchange for the victim's safe return. When no contact is made, it suggests that either the kidnapping isn't real or something has gone wrong. By late morning, Detective Arndt and other investigators on scene were growing increasingly concerned about what the silence might mean. Detective Arndt would later describe feeling uneasy about various aspects of the situation. She felt she needed more backup and support, but was having difficulty getting additional investigators to the scene promptly. She would later testify about her concerns regarding the dynamics in the house and about feeling somewhat isolated as the primary detective managing a situation that was becoming more complex and troubling as hours passed without contact from supposed kidnappers. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, approximately 7 hours after police had first arrived at the house, Detective Arndt made a decision that would prove to be the moment everything changed. She asked Fleet White and John Ramsey to conduct another search of the house. The instruction was to look carefully in all areas to see if they could find anything that had been missed or that might provide clues. This was a reasonable investigative step given the circumstances, but what it led to would fundamentally transform the investigation from a presumed kidnapping into a confirmed homicide. At approximately 1:05 p.m., John Ramsey and Fleet White went to the basement. They approached the storage room that Officer French had checked hours earlier. John Ramsey opened the door. He saw a white blanket on the floor. He immediately recognized it as a blanket from JonBenét's bedroom. He rushed into the room. JonBenét was there, wrapped in the blanket. She had been deceased for some time. In a moment of shock and paternal instinct, John Ramsey picked up his daughter and carried her upstairs. Fleet White, who was with John, later described the moment as surreal and deeply traumatic. They had spent the entire morning operating under the assumption that this was a kidnapping, that JonBenét had been taken from the house, that she might still be alive and that the family would get a ransom call. The discovery that she had been in the basement all along, that she had been deceased during all those hours of waiting, fundamentally changed everything about the case in an instant. John Ramsey appeared at the top of the basement stairs carrying JonBenét's body. Detective Arndt was in the main area of the house. She immediately understood that the situation had changed from kidnapping to homicide. The child was clearly deceased. Arndt directed that JonBenét be placed in a specific area. In the chaos and shock of the moment, several things happened that would later be recognized as problematic from an evidence preservation standpoint. John had already moved the body by carrying it upstairs before the scene could be documented. Arndt moved JonBenét's hands at one point. A blanket was placed over the child. These actions, while completely understandable given the emotional circumstances and the shock of the discovery, nonetheless affected the physical evidence in the crime scene. The entire nature of the response changed immediately. This was no longer a kidnapping case. This was a homicide that had occurred inside the house, probably during the night while the family slept. The Boulder Police Department began treating it as such, but by this point many hours had passed with multiple people present in the house. The crime scene had been significantly compromised. not through negligence, but through the reality of everyone having operated under incorrect assumptions about what had actually occurred. The coroner was called to the scene. Additional detectives and investigators arrived. The house was secured and sealed. Evidence collection began in earnest, but the damage to crime scene integrity had already occurred. This would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. How much critical evidence was lost or contaminated in those first 8 hours when the house was full of people? What might investigators have discovered if the scene had been secured from the very beginning as a homicide, rather than treated as a kidnapping? These questions would never be fully answered. The forensic examination of JonBenét's body was performed later that day by Dr. John Meyer, the Boulder County coroner. The examination revealed critical information about how she died. The official cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation associated with craniocerebral trauma. JonBenét had suffered a significant blow to the head that caused a skull fracture. The medical evidence suggested this injury would have been immediately incapacitating. She had also been strangled with a ligature device that had been constructed from materials found in the home. The sequence of these injuries and the exact timeline became subjects of extensive forensic analysis and debate. The examination also revealed evidence that investigators interpreted as possible indications of assault. Due to the sensitive nature of this case involving a minor, specific details of these findings remain in sealed court documents to this day. What can be stated is that this evidence became a significant factor in the investigation and contributed to various theories about what had occurred and who might have been responsible. The crime scene itself presented a complex picture. The ransom note had been written on paper from a notepad in the home, using a pen that belonged to the Ramseys. Investigators found what appeared to be a practice version of the ransom note, suggesting that whoever wrote the final 3-page note had made at least one false start. This indicated that the note writer had spent considerable time in the house, comfortable enough to sit and write a lengthy note, then start over when the first attempt wasn't satisfactory. There was no clear sign of forced entry into the house. The doors were reported to have been locked. A basement window was found open, and there was discussion about whether this could have been an entry or exit point. A suitcase was positioned beneath this window in a way that some investigators thought might have been used as a step. However, other investigators felt this could have been coincidental positioning. The question of how an intruder might have entered and exited the house without leaving clear signs became a major point of debate. In JonBenét's bedroom, the bed appeared to have been slept in, but there were no obvious signs of struggle or disturbance that would suggest something violent had occurred there. The room looked relatively normal. This raised questions about where and how the initial attack might have occurred. Various items found at the scene became subjects of forensic analysis and debate. A flashlight found on the kitchen counter received particular attention from some investigators, though its significance remained disputed. And then there was the DNA evidence. This evidence would become the most analyzed, most debated, and most controversial aspect of the entire investigation. When forensic scientists from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation examined JonBenét's clothing and other items from the crime scene, they collected numerous samples for analysis. Not all of these samples produced DNA profiles, but some did. And among them was a profile that would define the direction of the investigation for 3 decades. Forensic analysts identified an unknown male DNA profile from samples taken from the long underwear JonBenét was wearing when she was found. This profile was partial, meaning it contained genetic markers from several locations on the DNA strand, but wasn't a complete profile showing every marker that modern DNA analysis can identify. However, the profile that was developed contained enough genetic information to be distinctive. It was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, as an unknown profile. CODIS is a national DNA database maintained by the FBI that contains profiles from multiple sources. Convicted offenders in many states are required to provide DNA samples, and these profiles are entered into CODIS. DNA profiles from unsolved crimes are also entered, allowing for potential matches if the same person's DNA appears at multiple crime scenes. When the unknown male DNA from the Ramsey case was entered into CODIS in the late 90s, it began to be automatically compared against every profile in the database. That comparison has continued for over 27 years. There has never been a match. The DNA testing in 1997 used technology that was state-of-the-art for that time, but primitive compared to what would become available in later years. The techniques required relatively larger amounts of biological material and produced more limited genetic profiles than modern methods. But even with those technological limitations, the profile developed from the Ramsey evidence was distinctive enough to be useful for comparison purposes. It just didn't match anyone. The presence of this unknown male DNA immediately sparked debate among investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts. Some viewed it as the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. In their assessment, unknown male DNA on the victim's clothing, not matching anyone in the family or anyone with legitimate access to the child, strongly suggested an unknown perpetrator. If they could identify the source of that DNA, they would identify the person responsible for JonBenét's death. This perspective led to investigation focusing outward, looking for unknown suspects, pursuing intruder theories. But other investigators and experts were more skeptical about the DNA's significance. They argued that DNA transfer is complex, and that the mere presence of DNA doesn't automatically indicate involvement in a crime. DNA can be present on clothing for numerous innocent reasons. Workers at clothing manufacturing facilities can leave trace amounts of DNA on garments. People who try on clothes in stores can transfer DNA. DNA can be transferred through laundry processes, through secondary contact with objects, through numerous pathways that don't involve direct contact with the primary source. These skeptics felt that focusing too heavily on the DNA might be leading the investigation away from other important evidence. This wasn't simply an academic debate among scientists. This became a fundamental division that split the investigation along institutional lines. The Boulder Police Department, particularly in the first several years after the crime, largely focused their investigative efforts on theories involving people who lived in the house or had regular access to it. Their reasoning was based on multiple factors: the ransom note written on paper from the home, the lack of clear forced entry, aspects of the crime scene that suggested familiarity with the house layout, and behavioral evidence from interviews and observations. The district attorney's office, particularly as time went on and as DNA evidence was repeatedly analyzed and reanalyzed, increasingly focused on the unknown DNA as evidence of an intruder. Different district attorneys over the years took different positions, but by the mid-2000s, the DA's office had largely aligned with intruder theories based significantly on the DNA evidence. This created a situation where the two institutions that needed to work most closely together, police and prosecutors, were pursuing fundamentally different theories of the case. The consequences of this institutional division were severe and long-lasting. Effective criminal investigation requires close coordination between police and prosecutors. Police need prosecutors to provide legal guidance about what evidence is needed to support charges. Prosecutors need police to conduct thorough investigations that develop evidence that can be presented in court. When these two institutions are working toward different goals based on different theories, the investigation suffers. In the Ramsey case, this division manifested in multiple damaging ways. There were leaks to media from both sides, with information being released that seemed designed to support one theory or undermine another. There were public statements by officials that sometimes contradicted each other. There were reports of meetings where police and prosecutors argued about the direction of the investigation rather than working cooperatively. The dysfunction became public knowledge, which undermined confidence in the investigation and raised questions about whether anyone was actually in control of the case. This institutional conflict wasn't just about personalities or egos, though those factors may have played some role. It was fundamentally about differing interpretations of evidence, particularly DNA evidence. And because DNA science was still evolving rapidly during the late 90s and early 2000s, there was legitimate scientific debate about how to interpret the DNA findings. Different experts looking at the same evidence reached different conclusions about its significance. This scientific uncertainty created space for the institutional divisions to widen. In 1998, recognizing that the investigation had become controversial and was struggling to make progress, Boulder Police Chief Tom Kobe requested assistance from outside agencies. The FBI had been involved to some degree from the early days of the case, but this was a more formal request for comprehensive review and assistance. The FBI conducted an extensive review of all evidence and of the investigation's progress to that point. Their assessment, which was partially leaked to media over time, reportedly suggested that the evidence pointed more toward someone in the home than toward an unknown intruder. This FBI assessment was based on behavioral analysis of the ransom note, analysis of the crime scene, and standard criminal behavior patterns seen in similar cases. FBI profilers and behavioral analysts felt that aspects of the crime suggested it was not the work of an unknown intruder but rather of someone connected to the family. However, this assessment was disputed by other experts and by some prosecutors who felt the DNA evidence was being underweighted in the FBI's analysis. In 1999, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence in the case. Grand juries are investigative bodies that operate in secret and have the power to compel testimony and review evidence. The Ramsey case grand jury heard from dozens of witnesses over the course of more than a year. They reviewed extensive physical evidence, including the DNA findings. They heard from forensic experts on various aspects of the case, including handwriting analysis, DNA science, forensic pathology, and crime scene reconstruction. The proceedings were conducted entirely in secret, as grand jury proceedings typically are in Colorado. In October 1999, then District Attorney Alex Hunter held a press conference to announce the results of the grand jury process. He stated that no charges would be filed in the case. He indicated that while the grand jury had completed its work, the evidence was not sufficient to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. He thanked the grand jury for their service and indicated that the investigation would continue through other means. The public interpretation of this announcement was that the grand jury had reviewed all evidence and had declined to indict anyone. This interpretation remained the public understanding of what had occurred for over a decade. But in 2013, a remarkable revelation emerged. Following legal action by reporters and news organizations seeking access to grand jury materials, a court ordered the release of certain documents that had been sealed. These documents revealed something surprising. The grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey. However, the indictment was not for murder. It charged them with child abuse resulting in death and with being accessories to a crime. The theory that apparently emerged from the grand jury's deliberations was that even if they couldn't determine which parent might have been directly responsible for JonBenét's death, they believed that one or both parents had been involved in some way and had then taken actions to cover up what had occurred. This was reflected in the specific charges voted by the grand jury. However, the indictment had never been signed by District Attorney Hunter, which meant it was never filed and never became public until the 2013 court order. Under Colorado law, the district attorney has discretion about whether to sign and file an indictment, even when a grand jury votes to indict. This discretion exists because prosecutors are required to believe they can prove charges beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. Hunter's decision not to sign the indictment meant he didn't believe the evidence would support a conviction, regardless of what the grand jury had concluded. After the 2013 revelation made this decision public, Hunter explained his reasoning. He stated that he didn't believe the evidence met the standard required for prosecution, and that bringing charges he didn't believe could be proven would have been unethical. The DNA evidence played a role in Hunter's decision. The presence of unknown male DNA that didn't match anyone in the family created what Hunter viewed as reasonable doubt about family involvement. In the American criminal justice system, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If there's unknown DNA that could belong to the real perpetrator, how can you prove beyond reasonable doubt that someone else is guilty? This reasoning, while debatable, reflects the weight that was being given to the DNA evidence even at that early stage. The revelation about the grand jury vote created new controversy and debate. Critics of Hunter's decision argued that he should have moved forward with prosecution and let a trial jury decide whether the evidence supported conviction. They felt that district attorneys shouldn't be able to essentially nullify grand jury votes by refusing to sign indictments. Supporters of Hunter's decision argued that he had made the ethically correct choice, that prosecutors have an obligation not to bring charges they don't believe they can prove, and that wasting court resources and subjecting people to trial when conviction is unlikely would be wrong. This debate illustrated how deeply divided opinion was about this case, even among legal professionals. Different people viewing the same evidence reached dramatically different conclusions about what it meant and what should be done. And at the center of many of these disagreements was the DNA evidence and how much weight it should be given relative to other evidence. Meanwhile, the investigation continued through other avenues. Boulder police pursued numerous leads and potential suspects beyond the immediate family. Over the years, dozens of individuals came under investigative scrutiny. Some were people who had been in the Ramsey home for legitimate reasons in the months before the crime, workers who had done repairs, installers who had set up security systems, delivery personnel, contractors who had done renovation work. The Ramseys had held a Christmas party shortly before the murder, and guests at that party were interviewed. Anyone who might have seen the interior of the house, who might have learned about the family's routines or finances, who might have had opportunity to commit this crime, was investigated. Other potential suspects were individuals with criminal histories involving crimes against children. Boulder police, working with FBI resources, identified individuals who lived in Boulder or nearby areas in December 1996 who had records of similar offenses. These individuals were located, interviewed when possible, and asked to provide DNA samples for comparison against the unknown profile. One by one, these potential suspects were eliminated. Either their DNA didn't match the unknown profile, or they had alibis for the night of December 25th and 26th, or investigation revealed they had no plausible connection to the Ramsey family. The process of investigating and eliminating suspects is essential police work, but it's also frustrating when it doesn't lead to identification of the actual perpetrator. Each elimination narrows the field but doesn't provide positive answers. It tells you who didn't do it but not who did. In the Ramsey case, numerous individuals were investigated and cleared over the years, but none of this work led to identification of a viable suspect whose DNA matched the unknown profile and who had connection and opportunity to commit the crime. One individual who received significant attention from some investigators and researchers was Michael Helgoth. Helgoth lived in Boulder, had a criminal history, and allegedly owned boots that were similar to a boot print found at the Ramsey crime scene. He died by suicide in February 1997, just weeks after JonBenét's murder. Some people involved in researching the case believed Helgoth deserved serious consideration as a suspect. However, official investigation apparently did not develop evidence linking him definitively to the crime. There was no DNA match reported. There was no clear established connection between Helgoth and the Ramsey family. His death by suicide made it impossible to question him or investigate him further, creating a situation where he couldn't be conclusively eliminated, but also couldn't be definitively established as a suspect. Another individual who became a focus of investigative attention was Bill McReynolds, a retired journalism professor who had played Santa Claus at a Ramsey Christmas party shortly before JonBenét's death. The fact that he had been in the home and had interacted with JonBenét made him a person investigators needed to examine. McReynolds was investigated, interviewed, and provided DNA samples for comparison. According to reports, his DNA did not match the unknown profile from the crime scene. He also had alibis and explanations for his whereabouts. He was eventually cleared as a suspect, but not before he and his family experienced significant stress from the scrutiny and media attention. McReynolds maintained his innocence until his death in 2002. The reality of high-profile criminal investigations is that many innocent people come under suspicion and must endure investigation simply because they had some connection, however tangential, to the victim or the crime. These individuals must provide alibis, submit to questioning, give DNA samples, and have their lives examined in detail. It's an unfortunate but necessary part of thorough investigation. The Ramsey case involved numerous people who were investigated, had their lives disrupted, and were ultimately cleared of any involvement. In 2002, the case appeared to take a dramatic turn that briefly dominated national news coverage. A man named John Mark Carr, an American who had been working as a school teacher and was living in Thailand, contacted authorities claiming to have knowledge about the JonBenét Ramsey case. Over a period of communications, Carr's claims escalated until he eventually confessed to killing JonBenét. He provided what he claimed were details about the crime and stated he had been in love with the child. Carr's confession made international headlines. He was arrested in Bangkok and extradited to the United States. Media coverage was extensive and intense. Here, finally, appeared to be someone confessing to this infamous unsolved crime. But problems with the confession emerged almost immediately. Some of the details Carr provided about the crime were inconsistent with known facts. His timeline didn't match evidence from the investigation. And most significantly and definitively, when DNA testing was performed comparing Carr's DNA to the unknown male profile from the crime scene, there was no match whatsoever. Carr was immediately released from custody. His confession was determined to be false. The car incident illustrated a frustrating problem that plagues many high-profile cases. False confessions from individuals seeking attention, struggling with mental health issues, or motivated by other psychological factors. The JonBenét Ramsey case has received literally hundreds of confessions over the years from people who had no actual involvement in the crime. Each confession must be taken seriously initially and investigated, which consumes investigative resources and time. But the vast majority turn out to be false. This is an unavoidable reality of cases that receive massive public attention and media coverage. The DNA evidence played a crucial role in quickly eliminating Carr as a suspect. The DNA comparison was definitive. His DNA did not match the crime scene profile. This demonstrated one of the valuable functions DNA evidence serves. It can definitively eliminate innocent people from suspicion. In that sense, the DNA was working exactly as it should. But it also highlighted the ongoing problem. The DNA could eliminate suspects, but it couldn't identify who the DNA actually belonged to because that person wasn't in any searchable database. Patsy Ramsey died in June 2006 after a long battle with ovarian cancer. She was 49 years old. She passed away without ever seeing resolution in her daughter's case, without knowing who was responsible, without seeing justice achieved. Her death had significance for the investigation beyond the obvious human tragedy. For those investigators who had focused on family involvement theories, Patsy's death meant that one person who had been under suspicion could never be prosecuted. For those who believed in intruder theories, Patsy's death was simply an additional tragedy, compounding the original loss of JonBenét. In 2008, 2 years after Patsy's death, a development occurred that would become one of the most controversial moments in the entire investigation's history. The Boulder District Attorney's Office, now headed by Mary Lacey, commissioned new DNA testing using a technique that had recently been refined and was becoming more widely used in forensic investigations: touch DNA analysis. Touch DNA represented a significant advancement in forensic science capabilities. Traditional DNA testing requires visible biological material such as blood, saliva, or other fluids. Touch DNA can develop genetic profiles from epithelial cells, which are skin cells that are shed whenever we touch objects. The technique is extraordinarily sensitive, capable of developing profiles from just a few cells that might be left behind from touching or handling an item. Touch DNA had been used successfully in other investigations, and Lacey believed it might provide new insights in the Ramsey case. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's forensic laboratory applied touch DNA techniques to areas of JonBenét's clothing that had not been previously tested with this level of sensitivity. They focused particularly on the waistband area of the long underwear JonBenét was wearing when she was found. This area would presumably have been touched by whoever put on or removed the garment. Using touch DNA methods, forensic scientists developed a partial male DNA profile from this area. The finding that was considered significant by Lacey and the experts she consulted was that this newly developed profile appeared consistent with the unknown male DNA that had been previously identified from other areas of the clothing. This wasn't a new, different unknown profile. It appeared to be the same unknown male DNA, now found in an additional location through the more sensitive touch DNA technique. To proponents of intruder theories, this finding was highly significant. It suggested the DNA wasn't just random manufacturing contamination or incidental transfer from the retail supply chain. The same profile appearing in multiple locations, including an area that would have been touched while handling the garment, suggested direct contact by a single individual. Based on these DNA findings, along with her review of other evidence in the case, District Attorney Mary Lacey took an action that would prove to be extraordinarily controversial and would shape the investigation's trajectory for years to come. In July 2008, she sent formal letters to John Ramsey, to the estate of Patsy Ramsey, and to Burke Ramsey, officially clearing them as suspects in JonBenét's death. The letters stated that new DNA evidence, combined with other evidence and analysis, convinced her office that the Ramsey family members were not involved in the crime. Lacey publicly apologized to the family for the years of suspicion they had endured and stated clearly that in her assessment, an intruder was responsible for JonBenét's death. The exoneration letters made national news and sparked immediate controversy. Some current and former Boulder police investigators publicly disagreed with Lacey's decision. They felt she had given the DNA evidence excessive weight while minimizing or dismissing other evidence that they believed remained significant. They argued that touch DNA is particularly susceptible to transfer and contamination issues because it's so sensitive, and that finding consistent DNA in multiple locations wasn't as definitive as Lacey's conclusion suggested. They believed the exoneration was premature and that it inappropriately closed off investigative avenues that should remain open. Others supported Lacey's decision. Some DNA experts agreed with her assessment that the touch DNA findings were significant and probative. Some legal analysts argued that the family had been subjected to years of unfair suspicion despite the absence of conclusive evidence against them, and that the exoneration was appropriate and overdue. The debate over Lacey's decision illustrated how deeply divided opinion remained about the significance of the DNA evidence and about the proper direction for the investigation. One consequence of the 2008 exoneration that cannot be overlooked is that it created significant barriers to any future prosecution of family members, even if new evidence were to emerge, or if interpretations of existing evidence were to change. Once a district attorney has publicly exonerated someone, stating officially that they are innocent and apologizing to them for suspicion, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for any future prosecutor to reverse that position and bring charges. The exoneration created legal and practical barriers that would make prosecution of any previously cleared individual highly problematic. The debate over the DNA evidence's significance was not new in 2008, but the exoneration brought it to a head in a very public way. The fundamental question that had divided investigators and experts for years was this: does the presence of unknown male DNA on the victim's clothing necessarily indicate that DNA belongs to the perpetrator? Or could that DNA have innocent explanations that don't involve direct contact during the crime? Proponents of the DNA's significance pointed to several factors. The profile appeared in multiple locations on the clothing. It was consistently the same profile, not different profiles that might suggest multiple innocent transfer events. It appeared in areas that would likely have been touched during the commission of the crime. It didn't match anyone in the family or anyone known to have legitimate contact with the child. Taken together, these factors suggested to them that the DNA belonged to whoever committed the crime. Skeptics of the DNA's significance had counter-arguments. They noted that touch DNA is extraordinarily sensitive and can detect minute amounts of DNA from transfer that occurred days, weeks, or even longer before the crime. DNA can transfer through laundry processes, meaning DNA from one garment can transfer to another garment in the same wash load. DNA can be present from manufacturing and retail handling before the garment was ever purchased. The consistency of the profile in multiple locations might simply mean that DNA from a single innocent source had transferred to multiple areas through washing or wearing. They argued that the DNA's presence didn't definitively indicate it was deposited during the crime itself. This scientific debate reflects a broader reality about forensic DNA evidence. It's incredibly powerful, but it requires interpretation and context. DNA can tell us that a particular person's genetic material is present, but it doesn't automatically tell us when it was deposited, how it got there, or what it means. In the Ramsey case, everyone agreed that unknown male DNA existed and that it didn't match the family. The disagreement was about what conclusions should be drawn from those facts. Dr. Lawrence Kobylinski, a prominent forensic scientist who has worked on numerous high-profile cases, has stated publicly regarding the Ramsey case that he believes the DNA evidence is significant and deserves serious attention. He has noted that while DNA transfer is possible through various mechanisms, the pattern of DNA findings in this case suggests to him a probability of direct involvement. However, he has also emphasized the importance of considering all evidence, not just DNA, and has acknowledged that reasonable experts can disagree about interpretation. Dr. Dan Crane, another highly respected forensic DNA expert who has published extensively on DNA transfer mechanisms, has taken a more cautious position. His research has demonstrated that DNA can transfer through surprisingly indirect pathways. He has noted that touch DNA evidence in particular must be interpreted very carefully, because the sensitivity of the technique means it can detect DNA from transfer events that have nothing to do with the crime being investigated. He hasn't stated definitively that the Ramsey DNA is meaningless, but he has argued strongly against drawing absolute conclusions from touch DNA evidence without considering all possible explanations. These differing expert perspectives highlight why the DNA evidence in the Ramsey case became such a source of conflict. Respected scientists looking at the same evidence reached different conclusions about its significance. This wasn't because anyone was being dishonest or incompetent. It was because the science of DNA transfer and interpretation is complex, and legitimate scientific uncertainty exists in certain situations. When that scientific uncertainty exists, it creates space for different investigative theories and different prosecutorial decisions. The case returned to Boulder Police Department control in 2009 following the controversy over the exoneration and following Mary Lacey's term as district attorney ending. The new district attorney, Stan Garnett, stated that while he respected the work that had been done, he wanted the investigation back under police control in a more traditional structure. Boulder PD formed a small dedicated team to work the case going forward. They faced significant challenges. A case now over 12 years old, a crime scene that had been compromised from the beginning, decades of investigation that had pursued multiple theories, institutional conflicts that had created divisions and mistrust, an ongoing debate about the most important piece of physical evidence. Through the 2010s, the investigation continued more quietly. Boulder police didn't provide regular public updates, which some critics felt made the case seem forgotten, while the department argued this was appropriate for an active investigation, where revealing too much could compromise ongoing work. They consulted with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, with FBI experts, and with various forensic specialists on different aspects of the case. They continued to receive tips, which they investigated. They periodically reviewed all evidence with fresh eyes, looking for anything that might have been missed or that might be interpreted differently with the benefit of time and perspective. The landscape of forensic science was changing dramatically during this period. DNA technology was advancing at a rapid pace. Techniques for analyzing degraded or minimal DNA samples were improving. Databases were growing. And then, in the late 2010s, a revolutionary new approach emerged that would transform cold case investigation: forensic genetic genealogy. Forensic genetic genealogy combines traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research using consumer DNA databases. The technique works by uploading crime scene DNA profiles to consumer genealogy databases, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. When crime scene DNA is uploaded, the database algorithms identify people whose DNA shares segments with the crime scene DNA, indicating family relationships. These might be distant relatives, third cousins, or fourth cousins who share common ancestors several generations back. Genetic genealogists then use these identified relatives as starting points to build family trees. They research genealogical records, birth certificates, census data, obituaries, and other documents to map out family relationships going back generations. Once they've identified common ancestors shared by the various relatives, they work forward through time, identifying all descendants of those ancestors. This creates a pool of individuals who are related to the unknown person whose DNA was at the crime scene. From this pool, investigators must then identify which individuals fit the parameters of the case: the right age, the right gender if that's known, connection to the geographic area where the crime occurred, no solid alibis, and other factors specific to the investigation. This winnowing process can take the suspect pool from potentially hundreds of people down to a handful of viable suspects. Those suspects are then investigated traditionally, including obtaining their DNA legally for direct comparison to the crime scene sample. The technique gained international attention in April 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo had terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s, committing at least 13 murders, over 50 sexual assaults, and more than 100 burglaries. He had evaded capture for over 40 years. Traditional investigative methods had failed to identify him. His DNA was in CODIS, but had never matched anyone in that database because he had never been arrested. Investigators working with genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter uploaded DeAngelo's crime scene DNA to GEDmatch, a publicly accessible genealogy database. They identified distant relatives through the database. They built extensive family trees going back multiple generations. They worked forward through the descendants, identifying individuals who fit the profile, males of the right age who had lived in the areas where the crimes occurred. Eventually, they identified Joseph James DeAngelo. Surveillance confirmed he was still alive and living in Sacramento. When investigators obtained his DNA from a discarded item, it matched the crime scene DNA definitively. D'Angelo was arrested in April 2018 and ultimately pleaded guilty to 13 murders. The Golden State Killer case proved that forensic genetic genealogy could solve cases that had seemed unsolvable for decades. It demonstrated that even partial DNA profiles could be used successfully. It showed that even very distant familial relationships, third cousins or more distant, could lead to identification. The success galvanized the cold case investigation community. Within months, agencies across the country were using genealogy to solve cold cases. Dozens, then hundreds of cases were solved using the technique. The 1987 double murder of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook in Washington state was solved in 2018 when genealogy identified William Earl Talbot II. The 1992 murder of Angie Dodge in Idaho, a case that had resulted in a wrongful conviction, was finally correctly solved in 2019 when genealogy identified Brian Lee Dripps as the actual perpetrator. Case after case that had been cold for decades was suddenly being solved. Genealogy was proving to be one of the most significant advances in criminal investigation in generations. Naturally, attention turned to whether forensic genetic genealogy could be applied to the JonBenét Ramsey case. The unknown male DNA profile that had been in CODIS for over 2 decades without a match. Could it be uploaded to genealogy databases? Could distant relatives be identified? Could family trees be built that would finally reveal the identity of the person whose DNA was at that crime scene? These questions sparked both hope and renewed investigation. However, applying genealogy to the Ramsey case presents challenges that don't exist in every case. The DNA profile is partial and degraded in certain areas. It's not as complete as genealogists prefer to work with. A full modern DNA profile might show results for 30 or more genetic markers. The Ramsey profile has results for fewer markers, and some of those results are not as strong or clear as would be ideal. This doesn't mean genealogy is impossible, but it affects the likelihood of success and the confidence level in any matches that are identified. Additionally, there are legal, ethical, and policy considerations around uploading crime scene DNA to consumer genealogy databases. Different databases have different policies. GED Match, which was used in the Golden State Killer case and many others, has changed its policy several times regarding law enforcement access. Currently, GED Match requires users to opt in if they want their data to be available for law enforcement purposes. Many users are opted in, but many are not. This affects the pool of potential matches. Family Tree DNA has a different policy and has generally been more open to law enforcement use with appropriate legal process. Ancestry.com and 23andMe, which have much larger databases, generally do not allow law enforcement access without court orders or warrants, and even then only in limited circumstances. The fragmented nature of genealogy databases and the varying policies means that success with genealogy can depend on whether the right relatives happen to be in the right databases with the right privacy settings. There are also broader legal questions being worked out in courts across the country about the use of genealogy in criminal investigation. Is it a search under the Fourth Amendment? Does it violate privacy rights? Should there be statutory regulation of the practice? Different states are passing different laws. The legal landscape is still evolving. Boulder police and prosecutors must navigate these legal complexities while trying to use genealogy to potentially solve this case. Despite these challenges, Boulder police announced in 2021 that they were actively pursuing forensic genetic genealogy approaches in the Ramsey investigation. They indicated they were working with genetic genealogy experts and were exploring all possibilities for using the DNA evidence. They didn't provide specific details about progress, which is appropriate for an active investigation. But the announcement signaled that the investigation was incorporating cutting-edge techniques and had not given up on finding answers through DNA. In 2022, Boulder police released another statement indicating they had engaged a private laboratory that specializes in advanced forensic DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. While they didn't name the lab publicly, sources familiar with the investigation indicated it was one of the premier facilities in the country for this type of work. The lab's task was to extract maximum genetic information from the available evidence and to develop the most complete DNA profile possible for use in genealogy efforts. This work is extraordinarily painstaking. The DNA samples from the Ramsey case are now over 27 years old. They've been stored, tested, and retested multiple times over those decades. Each round of testing potentially consumes or degrades the sample further. Modern techniques can work with minimal amounts of DNA, but there are physical limits to what's scientifically possible. The laboratory work involves careful extraction, amplification, and sequencing of genetic material, trying to develop the fullest possible profile from samples that have been subjected to nearly 3 decades of handling and analysis. The challenge with forensic genetic genealogy isn't just technical. Even if a DNA profile can be successfully used in genealogy databases and matches are found, that's only the beginning of intensive investigative work. Suppose matches are found to several third cousins. Genealogists must build family trees for those cousins, working backward to identify common ancestors. Those ancestors might have lived in the 1800s. The genealogists must then work forward through all descendants of those ancestors to the present day. This could be hundreds or even thousands of individuals spread across multiple generations and geographic locations. From this large pool, investigators must identify individuals who fit certain criteria. Males if the DNA is male, individuals who would have been old enough in 1996 to commit the crime based on other evidence, individuals who had some connection to Boulder or reason to be there, individuals who don't have solid alibis for December 25-26, 1996. This winnowing process might narrow hundreds of potential suspects down to perhaps 5 or 10 viable candidates. Each of those must then be investigated thoroughly. Where did they live in 1996? What were they doing? Is there any evidence they were in Boulder? Is there any connection to the Ramsey family? Can they be eliminated through alibis? If someone emerges as a viable suspect who can't be eliminated, investigators must then legally obtain that person's DNA for direct comparison to the crime scene sample. This might involve surveillance to collect discarded items containing DNA, or seeking a warrant for a DNA sample. If the DNA matches, the investigation intensifies further with the goal of building a prosecutable case. This entire process can take years from initial genealogy work to potential arrest. The genealogy research alone can take months. The follow-up investigation can take additional months or years, and success is not guaranteed. It's possible that the DNA profile won't work well enough in genealogy databases. It's possible that matches won't be found because the person's relatives aren't in the databases. It's possible that all identified candidates can be eliminated. Forensic genetic genealogy is powerful, but it's not magic. It has limitations and doesn't solve every case where it's attempted. The question that hangs over all of this DNA work, including the genealogy efforts, is one that has divided this investigation from the beginning. Does the unknown DNA necessarily belong to the perpetrator? If the DNA has an innocent explanation, if it's from manufacturing contamination or secondary transfer or some other source unrelated to the crime, then all the genealogy work in the world will only identify an innocent person whose DNA happened to be on clothing for reasons having nothing to do with JonBenét's death. This is the fundamental uncertainty that has plagued the case for 3 decades. Without being able to definitively establish that the DNA came from the perpetrator, investigators face an impossible situation. They can't ignore the DNA because it might be the key to solving the case, but focusing heavily on it might be leading them away from the actual truth if the DNA isn't from the perpetrator. This uncertainty has created the divisions, delays, and controversies that have characterized this investigation. 3 decades have now passed since December 26, 1996. JonBenét Ramsey would have been 33 years old today had she lived. She never got to grow up, never got to experience adolescence or adulthood, never got to pursue dreams or build a life. The investigation into her death has now lasted longer than many people's careers in law enforcement. Investigators who worked the case in its early years have retired. New investigators have come in who weren't even in law enforcement when the crime occurred. Technology has advanced through multiple generations. The world has changed dramatically, but the case remains unsolved. The question of whether justice has been delayed isn't just about time passing. It's about whether the investigation has been structured and conducted in ways that made resolution possible, or whether systemic issues, particularly around DNA evidence interpretation, have actually prevented resolution. 3 decades is a long time. Many cold cases solved recently were decades old, but they were solved through focused, coordinated investigation using advancing technology. Has the Ramsey investigation been focused and coordinated, or has it been divided and misdirected by debates over evidence interpretation? The institutional conflicts between Boulder police and various district attorneys over the years have been documented and acknowledged by parties on both sides. The divisions weren't just about personalities. They reflected fundamental disagreements about evidence, about investigation priorities, about what theories should be pursued. These divisions affected the investigation's effectiveness. When institutions that need to work together are instead working at cross purposes, resolution becomes much more difficult. The question also arises: has the intense public and media attention helped or hindered the investigation? On one hand, public awareness means tips continue to come in decades later. Someone who knows something might finally come forward. Media coverage keeps pressure on authorities to continue working the case. On the other hand, media attention has brought false confessions, conspiracy theories, unreliable tips, and enormous pressure that may have affected decision-making at critical moments. The case became a spectacle, which isn't helpful for careful, methodical investigation. For John Ramsey, now in his 80s, the case represents a lifetime of loss and frustration. He lost his daughter in horrific circumstances. He lived under suspicion for years. He watched the investigation become mired in conflicts and controversies. He has advocated publicly for continued DNA work and genealogy efforts, believing that's the path to resolution. He has criticized what he views as investigative failures and missed opportunities over the years. Whether his criticisms are fair is debatable, but they reflect the perspective of a father who has waited 3 decades for justice for his daughter. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old when his sister died, has largely lived his life away from public attention. He gave an interview with Dr. Phil in 2016, one of his rare public statements about the case. He has taken legal action against media outlets when coverage implicated him. He has tried to build a life separate from the case that defined his childhood. The tragedy of losing his sister has been compounded by decades of public scrutiny. If the case is eventually solved, what might that look like? The ideal scenario would be DNA evidence, through genealogy or direct database match, leading to a specific suspect whose involvement can be corroborated through additional evidence. Perhaps witnesses could place the suspect in Boulder. Perhaps records would show connection to the Ramsey family. Perhaps when confronted, the suspect might provide information that only the perpetrator would know. Prosecutors would review all evidence and determine charges can be filed. An arrest would be made. A trial would occur. A jury would hear the evidence and reach a verdict. After 3 decades, there would finally be answers and justice. But resolution might not be that straightforward. It's possible DNA leads to someone who has since died, providing answers but making prosecution impossible. It's possible DNA leads to someone who can't be definitively connected to the crime beyond the DNA match, creating a situation where investigators believe they know who did it but can't prove it beyond reasonable doubt. It's possible the case is solved through evidence other than DNA, with the DNA question remaining unresolved. It's also possible, though no one wants to admit it, that the case might never be fully solved despite all efforts. The broader question this case raises for the criminal justice system is how to handle situations where scientific evidence is important, but its interpretation is disputed among experts. How should investigations proceed when different experts viewing the same evidence reach opposite conclusions? How should prosecutors make decisions when evidence significance is debated? How should institutions resolve conflicts over investigation direction? The Ramsey case doesn't provide good answers to these questions. Instead, it serves as a cautionary example of what can happen when these issues aren't effectively managed. JonBenét Ramsey was a child who deserved safety, who deserved to grow up, who deserved justice. The investigation into her death has consumed enormous resources, involved hundreds of investigators and experts, generated countless news stories and documentaries, and sparked endless public debate. But 3 decades later, no one has been held accountable for her death. Whether that lack of resolution is due to insufficient evidence, or due to how available evidence has been interpreted and used, or due to institutional failures, or some combination of all these factors, remains a matter of debate. What's not debatable is that a child died, a family was destroyed, and justice has not been achieved. The DNA evidence that was supposed to be the key to solving the case instead became the center of controversies that may have actually delayed resolution. Whether that delay can finally end Whether forensic genetic genealogy or other advancing techniques will finally provide answers. Whether the institutions involved can overcome 3 decades of division and dysfunction to pursue justice effectively, only time will tell. If you're interested in understanding how criminal investigations work in practice, including the challenges and systemic issues that can affect outcomes, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vault. Hit that notification bell for updates on this case and others where justice has been complicated by institutional, scientific, or systemic challenges. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you believe the DNA focus has helped or hindered this investigation? What do you think needs to happen for this case to finally be resolved? And remember, behind every unsolved case is a victim who deserved better, a family still seeking answers decades later, and systems that must be examined critically so that future investigations can learn from past challenges. Until next time, stay informed, think critically about how justice systems actually work versus how they're supposed to work, and never forget that every day justice is delayed is another day a victim's family waits for answers they deserve. 3 decades is too long. But as long as the investigation continues, as long as evidence is being analyzed, as long as new techniques are being applied, hope for resolution remains. Whether that hope will finally be realized remains one of the most important unanswered questions in modern American criminal justice.